In the spring of 1909, a small crew of men climbed down into a cave carved high above the Colorado River, deep inside the Grand Canyon. They carried lanterns, survey chains, and the backing of one of the most respected scientific institutions in the country. They believed they were about to prove that an ancient and advanced civilization had once lived beneath the American desert. The people who had walked that land for centuries believed something very different. The Hopi called the canyon a doorway between worlds, and they warned that whoever forced their way into the tunnels below would not return the same if they returned at all. A few weeks after the story broke, the newspapers went silent. The institution that was said to have funded the dig claimed it had no record of the men, the mission, or the cave. And the crew that walked into that tunnel, along with everything they said they discovered, quietly slipped out of the pages of history and was I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Never spoken of in any official record again. This is the story of what they were looking for, what the Hopi tried so hard to protect, and why, more than a century later, so many people still refuse to accept the version of events we were handed. To understand how a story like this could take root and refuse to die, you have to understand what the world looked like in 1909. This was the golden age of exploration. Men were racing to reach the poles, tunneling into the sands of Egypt, and hauling entire lost cities out of the jungles of Central America. Every few months seemed to bring another discovery that redrew the map of human history. The public was hungry for it. Newspapers knew that a headline promising a lost race or a buried treasure would sell copies faster than almost anything else on Earth. And at the very center of American science sat the Smithsonian Institution. It was the keeper of the nation's artifacts, the gatekeeper of the past, and in many ways the final word on what counted as real history. If the Smithsonian confirmed a discovery, it became fact. If the Smithsonian stayed quiet, that discovery tended to fade into rumor and then into nothing at all. That kind of authority is exactly what gives this story its teeth, because the men who still tell it insist that letting a discovery fade was never an accident. They say it was the entire point. The Grand Canyon itself was still mostly unknown in those years. Vast stretches of it had never been properly mapped. Its side canyons ran for miles into the rock, twisting into shadow, and many of its caves had never felt the touch of a modern boot. To the scientists of the era, the canyon was a blank space, a puzzle waiting to be solved and claimed. To the Hopi, the Havasupai, and the other native peoples who had lived alongside it for generations, it was nothing of the sort. It was sacred ground, older than memory, and certain parts of it were never meant to be entered by human hands at all. The story began, at least in the form most people know today, on April 5th, 1909, on the front page of a paper called the Arizona Gazette. The headline promised an underground citadel, and the article beneath it described a find that, if it were true, would rank among the greatest discoveries in the history of archaeology. According to the paper, an explorer named G.E. Kincaid had been traveling down the Colorado River alone by boat when he noticed something strange along a canyon wall. High above the waterline, cut into the sheer face of the rock, was the entrance to what looked like a man-made tunnel. Kincaid climbed up to it, lit his lantern, and stepped inside. What he described next did not sound like anything that had any business existing in the American Southwest. The main tunnel, he claimed, ran for nearly a mile straight back into the mountain. Branching off of that central passage were dozens of side chambers, arranged with a symmetry and precision that suggested deliberate design rather than the work of wind and water. In those rooms, he said, he found copper implements hardened by some lost technique that modern smiths could not reproduce. He found tablets covered in symbols that matched no known alphabet. He described a grey metal that resembled a blend nobody could identify, and urns and jars still holding the residue of things long turned to dust. And then he described the idols. Seated cross-legged, hands resting on their knees, faces calm and unfamiliar, they looked less like anything from the Americas and more like figures out of the temples of the Far East. There was a central hall, he said, with passages leading off it in every direction like the spokes of a great wheel, and at the heart of it stood a figure that reminded him of images he had seen of gods from the other side of the world. Then there were the crypts. The account claimed the chambers held row upon row of preserved bodies, each one wrapped and laid out with care, some of them far taller than any ordinary man. The whole complex, the article suggested, was large enough to have sheltered tens of thousands of people. This was not a cave that a few wanderers had stumbled into and abandoned. This was described as a city, a hidden metropolis sealed inside a mountain and left to sleep in the dark. The article did not stop at wonder and awe. It went into oddly specific detail, the kind of detail that hoaxes usually work hard to avoid and that believers have clung to ever since. It described a great shrine at the heart of the complex, and within it an idol seated cross-legged, holding what looked like a lotus flower, ringed by smaller carved figures the way a temple encircles its central god. It described a hall of symbols where every wall was covered in careful rows of markings, as though the entire history of the place had been written into the stone for anyone who could read it. It spoke of granaries still holding hardened seeds, of copper spearheads and slings that hinted at old wars, and of that pale yellowish metal, worked and shaped by hand, that no one on the crew could name. Whoever wrote the piece did not sketch a vague and comfortable mystery. They built a place with rooms and corners and objects you could almost reach out and touch. Here is where the story takes the turn that has kept it alive for over 100 years. The article did not credit some lone adventurer with the find and leave it there. It stated that the excavation was being carried out under the direction of the Smithsonian Institution itself. It named a lead scientist, a Professor S.A. Jordan, and it described a full crew already on site, cataloguing artifacts and slowly working their way deeper into the tunnels with every passing day. The paper spoke of hieroglyphs carved into the walls in a style that looked Egyptian. It described idols that seemed to borrow from Egyptian and Tibetan religion at the same time, sitting together in the same rooms as though the people who built the place had drawn from traditions separated by whole oceans. And it raised a possibility that, if taken seriously, would not simply add a chapter to the history books. It would rip the existing chapters apart. The suggestion was that a civilization from the far side of the planet had somehow crossed the seas, travelled up a river into the burning heart of the American desert, and carved a home into the living rock thousands of years before Columbus was ever born. What makes the article so stubborn, so hard to simply laugh off and forget, is that very specificity. Most tall tales stay comfortably vague because vagueness is difficult to disprove. This one did the opposite. It gave a named explorer, a named professor, a named institution, distances measured in feet, and a layout precise enough to sketch on paper. To the skeptics, that reads as a talented hoaxer showing off, dressing plain fiction in the careful costume of a field report. To the believers, it reads as a genuine account that was simply too detailed and too threatening to be allowed to stand, and so it had to be denied out of existence rather than merely ignored. The very same handful of details fuels both readings at once, and after more than a century, neither side has ever managed to fully dislodge the other. But long before the Arizona Gazette printed a single word about any of this, the Hopi already carried their own account of what lay beneath the canyon, and it was not an invitation. It was a warning that had been passed down for longer than anyone could count. In Hopi belief, humanity did not begin its story on the surface of the earth. It emerged from below, climbing up through a series of previous worlds, each one left behind after its people fell into corruption and ruin. The place of that emergence into this present world is called the Sipapu, and many traditions locate it within the Grand Canyon itself, near where the Little Colorado meets the greater river. To the Hopi, the canyon was never just a scenic wonder to be photographed and mapped. It was the birthplace of the people, the very passage through which they had entered this world, and a doorway that still connected upward to the sky and downward to the worlds that came before. In the fuller telling, this present world is the fourth that the people have lived in. The first three were each left behind after their inhabitants lost their way, and those worlds were destroyed in turn by ice, by wind, and by a great flood. Guarding the way into this fourth world, in many accounts, stands Masar, the caretaker of the earth and the keeper of death, who granted the people permission to live here on one condition: that they never forget where they came from or why the earlier worlds had fallen. The Sipapu is remembered even now in the floor of the traditional kiva as a small round hole, a deliberate reminder of that emergence, a link held open on purpose between this world and the ones beneath it. To disturb the true doorway carelessly, in that worldview, was never simply trespassing on an empty ruin. It was tampering with the seam between worlds itself. Those lower worlds were not thought to be empty. The old stories spoke of beings who dwelled beneath the surface. Among them were what some traditions call the ant people, who were said to have taken the Hopi in and fed them and sheltered them underground during times when the surface above was scoured by fire and by flood. The world below was a place of refuge in the deepest need, but it was also a place of enormous power, and it was not to be disturbed by the curious, the greedy, or the proud. So when outsiders came, hunting for gold, for artifacts, for proof of their own theories about the ancient past, the elders reportedly gave the same warning again and again in different words. Some doors are closed for a reason. What sleeps below is not yours to wake. Those who force their way into the sacred places take on a debt that they cannot pay, and in time the canyon comes to collect what it is owed. And it was not only the Hopi who held the canyon sacred. Deep inside it, in a hidden side canyon of blue-green water and tumbling waterfalls, the Havasupai people have lived for centuries and live there still, the only community to make its permanent home within the walls of the Grand Canyon. For them, too, this was never empty scenery waiting to be surveyed and claimed. It was home, and it was holy, and the notion that outsiders might come to pry open its hidden places for profit and prestige struck at something far deeper than any question of property or law. To the men of 1909, standing there with their lanterns and their survey tools and the full confidence of modern science, all of this was superstition, folklore, the sort of thing you nodded at politely and then set aside the moment the speaker turned away. They had a mountain full of treasure to document and a history to rewrite in their own names. The warnings of a native people did not enter into their calculations at any point. That, according to those who still tell this story around the world today, was the first mistake they made. Picture the scene the way the believers describe it. A crew lowering themselves down the canyon wall on ropes, hauling heavy equipment up to a tunnel mouth that sits hundreds of feet above the river, with nothing but empty air and a long fall beneath their boots. Inside, the air is cool and still and utterly dead, undisturbed for who knows how many centuries. Their lanterns throw long, trembling shadows down a corridor that runs arrows straight into a darkness their light cannot begin to fill. They move deeper. Room after room opens up on either side, and each one seems to hold something stranger than the last. Tablets they cannot read. Statues whose faces stare back at them without warmth, belonging to no people they have ever known. Tools of a metal they cannot name. And always, at the center, that great branching hall, with its passages running off in every direction, sloping down and down into the rock, further than any lamp can carry. The account claims the crew spent weeks in that place, mapping and digging and cataloguing by lamplight, slowly filling their notebooks with wonders. And then, the story goes, the reports simply stopped. This is the part that gives the legend its cold and beating heart, because in the version handed down across the decades, the men who pushed into the deepest of those tunnels did not all come back out again. Some tellings say a portion of the team followed a passage that seemed to have no bottom, chasing it down into the dark, and were never seen or heard from again. Others say the men who did climb back into the sunlight came out, changed, hollowed out somehow, unwilling to speak of what they had found in the lowest chambers, waking at night from things they could not put into words. The exact details shift and slide depending on who is doing the telling, and that slipperiness is part of what makes the whole thing so hard to grab hold of. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. There is no official casualty list. There is no roll of the missing, because officially there was never any expedition at all, and that is the wall that every version of this story eventually crashes into. When researchers went looking for hard proof, they did not find a triumphant follow-up story in the Arizona Gazette announcing the discovery to the world. They found silence. There was no second article. There were no photographs. There were no artifacts placed on display in any museum, no tablets behind glass, no idols in any collection. There was no professor by the name given in the story anywhere in the Smithsonian's records. When the institution has been asked about it over the years, its answer has been flat and consistent. It has no knowledge of any such expedition. It has no record of anyone by that name in its employ. And it knows of no cave of Egyptian origin anywhere in the Grand Canyon. For most historians, that closes the case. The 1909 article was almost certainly a hoax, a piece of colourful newspaper fiction from a time when papers fought for readers by printing the wildest tales they could dream up. Without verification, without artifacts, and without a single supporting record, there is simply nothing left to stand on. Case closed. But for the people who keep this legend burning, the Smithsonian's denial is not the end of the argument at all. It is the very centre of it. Because if you already believe that the official keepers of the past have a long habit of quietly burying whatever does not fit their story, then a flat denial is not evidence that nothing happened. It is precisely what a cover-up would be expected to look like. The absence of proof, in that frame of mind, becomes a kind of proof all its own. The believers are also quick to point out that 1909 was hardly an isolated case. The newspapers of that era were full of reports of strange discoveries that flared brightly for a day and then vanished without a trace. Accounts of enormous skeletons unearthed by farmers, of towering mummies pulled from ancient burial mounds, of odd walls and chambers found and then somehow lost again, appeared in respectable papers all across the country. And a striking number of them ended the same way, with the relics said to have been carried off by agents of the very same national institution, never to be seen or displayed again. To a skeptic, this only proves that giant and lost race stories were a wildly popular genre of the day, printed to thrill a bored public and then forgotten by the next morning. To a believer, it looks like a pattern, a slow and patient gathering up of everything that did not fit the accepted story, carried out quietly and in plain sight across decades. And this is the moment the story stops being about a single cave in Arizona and starts being about something much larger and much stranger. Consider a detail that is not folklore and not a newspaper hoax. It is a fact you can check for yourself on any modern map of the Grand Canyon. Scattered across the canyon stand enormous rock formations, towers of stone rising from the depths, and a great many of them carry names that have nothing whatsoever to do with the American frontier that surrounds them. There is a formation called Isis Temple. There is another called Osiris Temple. There is a Tower of Set and a Tower of Ra. There is a Cheops Pyramid, a Buddha Temple, a Shiva Temple, a Brahma Temple, and a Zoroaster Temple. These names are real, and they are official. They were placed on the maps in the late 1800s by geologists and surveyors who looked up at these massive natural structures and reached over and over again for the gods and monuments of Egypt and the East. The believers ask a question that is genuinely hard to wave away. Why would the men mapping a remote canyon in Arizona choose to name its features after Egyptian and Asian deities, unless something about the place put those very civilizations in their minds? The standard answer is that it was simply the fashion of the age, a romantic and grandiose style of naming that the surveyors of that generation loved. The alternative answer, the one whispered on late-night forums, is that the names are a fingerprint left in plain sight, a quiet record of what was really discovered there, before the doors were sealed and the questions were buried. You are free to decide for yourself which answer feels like the whole truth. And now we arrive at the idea that ties every loose thread of this together for a growing number of people. The theory of Tartaria. Tartaria is not a story about one hidden cave. It is a sweeping alternative history of the entire world, and once you see its shape, the Grand Canyon story slides into it like the final piece of a puzzle. The core claim runs like this. At some point in the not-so-distant past, closer to our own time than we are told, there existed a vast and advanced global civilization, unified across continents in ways we can barely picture, with architecture and technology far beyond what the official timeline is willing to allow. And then, within a strangely short span of time, that whole civilization was wiped away. Its history was rewritten from top to bottom. Its achievements were quietly reassigned to lesser cultures or dismissed as legend. Even its name was scrubbed out of the record until almost no one remembered it had ever been spoken. Believers point to old maps that label enormous stretches of Asia with the single word Tartary, a name that appears again and again for centuries and then, curiously, thins out and vanishes from the atlases. They point to the grand old buildings that stand in cities all over the planet, structures they argue are too ornate, too refined, and far too similar across continents that supposedly had no contact to have been built by the modest societies credited with them. They point to what they call the mud flood, the theory that countless old buildings were partly buried in sediment, their true ground floors swallowed beneath the earth, as though some great catastrophe once swept across the world, and the dazed survivors simply built on top of the ruins and forgot what had come before. The theory reaches further still. Its followers point to the star-shaped fortresses that ring old cities across Europe and beyond, arguing that their strange geometry served some purpose the textbooks have long since forgotten. They point to the great world's fairs of the late 1800s, with their sprawling white palaces of impossible detail, officially raised in a matter of months, and then torn down again just as fast, and they ask how such marvels could ever have been meant as temporary. And they describe a reset, a deliberate closing of the old world, after which trainloads of orphaned children were supposedly scattered across an emptied land to grow up knowing nothing of what had come before them. Each individual claim has an ordinary answer waiting patiently beside it. Stacked together in the right order, though, and viewed by someone already inclined to distrust the official record, they can begin to feel like the rough outline of a crime. Within that framework, the Grand Canyon tunnels are not a strange little footnote. They are a key piece of evidence. A sealed chamber packed with artifacts that blend Egyptian, Asian, and unknown origins is exactly what you would expect to unearth as a relic of a single, connected old-world civilization that once stretched across every continent on Earth. The towering mummies, the unknown metals, the idols that fuse traditions from opposite sides of the globe. To a believer, none of that is a contradiction to be explained away. It is the entire thesis, confirmed in stone. And the reason you have never been taught any of it, they argue, is the very same reason the Arizona Gazette story died so quietly in 1909. Because an institution that was built to guard one official version of history cannot afford to let a rival version stand beside it. The threat is not that the alternative might be false. The threat is that it might be believed. It is worth stopping here and being honest about what actually holds up under weight and what does not. The 1909 newspaper article has never been confirmed by any independent source. No artifact from this supposed cave has ever surfaced anywhere in the world. No credible trace of the professor named in the story has ever been found in any archive. The Egyptian and Asian temple names in the canyon are perfectly real, but historians have a plain and well-documented explanation for them that requires no lost race at all, only the flowery naming habits of Victorian-era surveyors. And the wider Tartaria theory sits far outside anything the surviving evidence can support. The old maps used the word Tartary as a loose label for a region and its scattered peoples, not as the proper name of some hidden superstate. Buildings resemble one another across the world because architectural styles were copied, shared, and revived across generations. And the famous buried ground floors almost always have ordinary explanations rooted in how growing cities raise their streets and bury their basements over time. None of that is hidden knowledge. You can walk each one of these explanations back to its source and check it for yourself in an afternoon. But here is what keeps the story breathing anyway, long after the facts should have put it to rest. It was never really about whether one particular cave existed. It is about a feeling that a great many people quietly carry, a suspicion that the tidy history they were handed in school is a little too clean, a little too settled, and a little too convenient for the very people who wrote it down. The Grand Canyon legend gives that vague suspicion a sharp and memorable shape. A hidden doorway in the rock, a crew that walked in and did not all walk out, a dominant institution that looks you in the eye and says nothing ever happened. Whether or not that tunnel was ever real, the story endures because the distrust underneath it is entirely real, and it is not going anywhere. And through the whole tangled affair, the voice that most often gets drowned out is the one that was there long before any of it. The Hopi did not need a newspaper to tell them that the canyon held something sacred. Their warnings were never a plot device in a mystery to be solved. They were the expression of a relationship with that land stretching back generations beyond count, long before the first surveyor ever arrived with his chain and his ambition and his list of borrowed Egyptian names. There is something worth sitting quietly with in that. Strip away the towering mummies and the lost empires and the theories that race across the internet at midnight, and you are left with a much older and far simpler idea. That certain places carry a weight the eye cannot measure. That not everything buried was meant to be dug up, and that the relentless drive to open every door, catalogue every secret, and claim every discovery in the name of progress might carry a price the men of 1909 never once thought to count. It is a strange thing when you step back from it that a story carrying so little hard evidence can hold on to so much weight, but maybe that is the very nature of the questions it raises. A cave full of gold could be proven or disproven and then filed away and forgotten. A doorway between worlds cannot. It endures in the imagination precisely because it can never be fully opened or fully closed, and every new generation that stumbles onto it gets to stand at the threshold and wonder for itself. The Hopi called the canyon a doorway. Modern science calls it a rock formation shaped by a few million years of patient water. The believers call it a cover-up stretching from a small Arizona newsroom all the way to the marble halls of Washington. And somewhere in the space between those three answers, refusing to fully belong to any of them, the story simply keeps on living. So what really happened down in the Grand Canyon in 1909? The most likely answer, and the honest one, is that a struggling newspaper printed a thrilling tale to move copies off the stand, and it worked far better and lasted far longer than anyone who set that type could ever have imagined. There was probably no crew, probably no tunnel lined with crypts and idols, probably no professor lowering himself by lamplight into the dark, but probably has never once been the same word as certainly. And that narrow gap between the two is precisely where every legend worth telling has always made its home. More than 100 years later, those tunnels still pull at something in people. Not because the evidence is strong, because it plainly is not, but because the questions buried underneath the story simply refuse to lie still. Who gets to decide what counts as history, and what gets quietly filed away as myth? What becomes of the discoveries that do not fit the neat story we have already agreed among ourselves to tell? And how many warnings, from how many people who knew the land intimately long before we ever arrived, have we brushed aside without a second thought on our confident march toward proving how much we know? The Hopi warned them not to enter. Whether anyone ever entered at all, we may never truly know. But the warning itself has outlived every expedition, every headline, and every official denial that came after, and perhaps that is the one part of this whole strange story that was always quietly true, that some doorways really are better left closed, and that some questions hold more power left unanswered in the dark than any discovery dragged into the light could ever hope to match. The canyon keeps its silence. It always has, and perhaps it always will do so. And the tunnels, real or imagined, keep their secrets still.